Mark Elkins was once a trusted corrections officer, Donna a beloved librarian, and their grandson Jeremy just a troubled teen, but when all three were found brutally murdered in their suburban home, their bloodied bodies surrounded by strange symbols and silence, investigators uncovered a past so horrific, so buried in institutional abuse, that even seasoned detectives said they had never seen such violence and abuse. In the quiet town of Millstone, life moved slowly and predictably. Surrounded by thick woods and old farmland, it was the kind of place where neighbors waved from their porches, kids played in the street until sunset, and people trusted one another without question. Nothing ever seemed to happen there. Crime was rare, and when it did occur, it was usually something small: a stolen bike, a bar fight, a missing cat. So when a delivery driver called 911 on the morning of October 18th to report a wide-open front door at 17 Red Willow Lane, no one expected what was about to unfold. The house belonged to the Elkins family. Mark and Donna Elkins had lived there for over 30 years. They were well liked by everyone, known for their quiet nature and clean yard. Their teenage grandson Jeremy had recently moved in after some trouble at school, but the family still kept a low profile. The delivery driver, shaken and pale, told the dispatcher he'd knocked several times before stepping inside. He said it smelled like metal and rot. When the first officer arrived, he entered the house and stumbled out seconds later, vomiting in the front yard. Backup was called immediately. Inside the home, officers discovered a gruesome and chaotic scene. 3 bodies were sprawled across the living room: Mark, Donna, and young Jeremy. The violence inflicted on them was beyond anything the department had ever seen. They had been beaten so severely that their faces were barely recognizable. Blood was splattered across the walls, and much of the furniture was broken or overturned. Strange symbols had been carved into the drywall in erratic patterns, some made with a sharpened object that police later determined to be a bone. Even more disturbing was the complete lack of fingerprints anywhere in the home. Not on the doorknobs. Not on the light switches, not even on the coffee mugs in the kitchen. It was as if the house had been scrubbed clean after the massacre, leaving no trace of the killer. Yet the scene itself was chaotic, rage-driven and brutal, not something one would associate with a careful, calculating mind. This contradiction puzzled investigators from the beginning. The neighborhood was quickly cordoned off, and residents were questioned. No one had seen or heard anything unusual. A neighbor's doorbell camera captured the sound of dogs barking around 3 a.m., but there was no footage of anyone approaching or leaving the house. The only footage that did surface came from a gas station down the road. A figure in a black hoodie and mask was seen buying bleach and duct tape hours before the crime. His face was hidden, and he paid in cash. He left no vehicle, no trail. As word of the killing spread, fear began to settle in the town like fog. People who had never locked their doors began installing cameras and security systems. Parents kept their children close. The illusion of safety had been shattered. For the first time in its history, Millstone wasn't just a quiet town anymore. It was the center of something horrific, and the police knew they were facing a case unlike any they had encountered before. In the days following the murders, investigators began piecing together the lives of the victims in an attempt to find motive or connections that could explain such an act. Mark Elkins had spent most of his adult life working as a corrections officer at a now-closed juvenile detention facility just outside Millstone. He had retired early in 2001 due to a reported back injury and had since lived a quiet life with his wife, Donna, who had been the town's librarian for nearly 2 decades. Both were described by locals as polite but reserved, rarely attending town events or gatherings. Their grandson Jeremy, only 16, had recently been sent to live with them after being expelled from his high school for violent behavior. According to school records, Jeremy had been involved in multiple fights and displayed signs of severe emotional distress, but no formal therapy had ever been arranged for him. As police combed through the house for any leads, they made a disturbing discovery. Hidden behind a loose tile beneath the kitchen sink Inside a small gap in the wall was an old, water-damaged photograph. It showed a group of children, thin, bruised, some with expressions frozen in fear. At the center stood a younger Mark Elkins, wearing the uniform of a corrections officer, with a slight smirk on his face. The photo was dated July 1994 and scribbled on the back were the words, E-block, after lights out. This photograph shifted the focus of the investigation entirely. The facility in the photo, now identified as the Elridge Youth Detention Center, had been quietly shut down in the early 2000s following a brief internal inquiry that yielded no criminal charges. Rumors of abuse had circulated at the time, but no one had stepped forward with hard evidence, and many assumed the allegations were exaggerated or fabricated. With the facility closed and most of its records sealed, what had taken place there was largely forgotten until now. Detectives started reviewing archived articles, court documents, and employment files. They found that 4 staff members, including Elkins, had been placed on leave during the inquiry into misconduct, but the case was never pursued due to a lack of credible testimony. Several former inmates were listed in those reports, but contact information was either missing or outdated. What stood out, however, was a handwritten memo from a social worker noting the unusual number of complaints against Elkins and a pattern of injuries among the same group of boys under his supervision. The implications were troubling. Investigators now considered the possibility that the murders were not random at all, but part of a larger, calculated act of revenge. If that were true, they needed to find out who had been at that facility, who had suffered under Elkins' authority, and whether someone had finally come back to settle a decades-old score. With the evidence mounting and more questions arising, the once straightforward murder case was transforming into something far darker, a reckoning rooted deep in the past. As the image of the children and the unsettling history of Elridge Youth Detention Center came to light, public interest in the case surged. The photo was leaked to a true crime forum, and within days, a thread titled, "What Happened at Elridge?" exploded with activity. Users from across the country began sharing stories, documents, and even old news clippings that had long been buried. Among the posts were first-hand accounts, people who claimed they had been imprisoned at Elridge in the early 1990s, and who described experiences that were deeply disturbing. Each testimony painted a picture of systematic abuse, psychological torment, and utter abandonment by the outside world. One user, posting under the name Broken E-block, claimed to have been just 13 when he was sent to Elridge for truancy. He described being held in solitary confinement for days, stripped of clothing, and denied food. Another user shared a scar on his arm in the shape of a jagged E, claiming it was branded there by staff as punishment for speaking out. Multiple survivors referenced a secret wing of the facility referred to as the Deep Dorms, where the most brutal punishments were carried out. Strikingly, all of them mentioned one specific guard by name or description, Mark Elkins. As the thread grew, a researcher cross-referenced old death certificates and found an alarming pattern. At least 5 former Elridge staff members had died under suspicious circumstances in the past decade. One died in a fire-ruled accidental, another in a car crash with failed brakes, and one reportedly took his own life without leaving a note. At the time, none of these deaths had drawn much attention, but when placed side by side, they painted a new, chilling narrative. Someone, it seemed, had been hunting them down one by one. The online community grew convinced that the Elkins murders were part of a larger campaign of revenge. Someone had not only survived Elridge but was now delivering justice in the most brutal form imaginable. For many, it was impossible to feel sympathy for the victims once the truth of their past was unearthed. But for law enforcement, the morality of the killer's motive didn't matter. What mattered was stopping whoever was behind it. Investigators followed every lead, including tracking down individuals who had posted on the forum. One of them, a man named Troy Kellum, agreed to speak to detectives. He had served time at Elridge from 1992 to 1995 and confirmed the horrors described online. He also revealed that a small group of former inmates had stayed in contact over the years, communicating through hidden forums and encrypted emails. They called themselves the Marked, a reference to the scars many had received at the facility. Callum mentioned one person in particular, Carson Dre. He had been the most vocal about seeking retribution. Dre had disappeared years ago, claiming he was done waiting for justice that would never come. He had stopped responding to messages shortly after the first staff member's mysterious death. As authorities began to connect the pieces, it became clear that this wasn't just a series of murders, it was a calculated crusade, and it wasn't over. The break investigators desperately needed came from an unexpected source: surveillance. Footage retrieved from a gas station just a few blocks from the Elkins residence revealed a figure that, while concealed, offered subtle clues. The footage showed a tall individual in a black hoodie and surgical mask purchasing duct tape, bleach, and gloves. What caught the attention of the analysts was the way the person moved, a noticeable limp in the left leg, slight but consistent. The timestamp placed the visit less than 6 hours before the murders occurred. The clerk remembered nothing unusual, only that the man didn't speak a word and paid in cash. Investigators cross-referenced past employees and former inmates from Elridge Youth Detention Center, searching for anyone with a known injury or mobility issue. That's when the name Carson Dre resurfaced. A former inmate from the mid-90s, Dre had sustained a severe leg injury while trying to escape the facility in 1995. According to internal reports, his attempt failed, and he was punished with prolonged isolation and denied medical treatment for weeks. When he was finally released from Elridge at age 17, there were no follow-up records, no therapy, and no legal support. He simply vanished from the system. Dre had remained off the radar for years until a missing persons report was filed in 2019 by a roommate who said he had left home one day and never returned. The case was closed due to lack of evidence, and his name faded once again into obscurity. Now, with new leads and the pattern of targeted killings becoming clearer, Dre moved to the center of the investigation. When police visited his last known address, a rundown apartment above a pawn shop, they found it abandoned and gutted. However, neighbors recalled seeing Dre regularly until a few years ago, describing him as polite, quiet, and always wearing long sleeves and a noticeable limp. The trail eventually led investigators to an abandoned train depot on the outskirts of a nearby town. The entrance had been barricaded with metal sheeting and old furniture, but inside, what they found was deeply unsettling. There were dozens of notebooks stacked in piles, each one meticulously filled with names, timelines, photos, and observations. One wall had been turned into a floor-to-ceiling map marked with red pins, lines connecting former Elridge staff across several states. Surveillance photos had been taken of their homes, workplaces, and family members. It was a war room for a long, methodical operation. Among the documents was a manifesto of sorts, written in neat block letters and signed only as The Reckoner. It described years of pain, abuse, and a justice system that had turned its back on the most vulnerable. The author wrote of watching his abusers grow old in peace while the victims carried lifelong trauma. In his words, what the courts never corrected, he would. The final pages listed 5 names. 3 were already dead, 1 was Mark Elkins, and the last name hadn't yet been crossed out. That name was Stephen Cross, a former guard who now lived in rural Pennsylvania under a new identity. The message was clear: the list was still active, and time was running out. 3 months after the Elkins murders, in the cold stillness of a Pennsylvania winter, another body was found. It was Stephen Cross, a man who had quietly vanished from public records over a decade ago, now discovered in the basement of his farmhouse, bound, mutilated, and left beneath a hastily scrawled message on the wall: "You will remember us." The phrase matched the chilling signature left behind at the Elkins home, both in tone and in method. Just like before, there were no fingerprints, no traces of the killer, and no signs of forced entry. The crime scene had been meticulously cleaned, save for the brutality that could not be erased. Cross had been the final name on the list found at the abandoned train depot. But for investigators, it didn't feel like the end. News of Cross's death sent waves of fear through a very specific Group of people, former staff from Elridge Youth Detention Center. Some had long since changed their names, moved across the country, even left the US altogether. But now, many of them came forward voluntarily, pleading for protection. One man admitted he hadn't slept without a loaded gun in years, while another confessed to installing dozens of cameras around his home, certain he was next. Though the list from the train depot contained only 5 names, investigators feared there could be more: unlisted targets, unknown accomplices, or unfinished plans. The FBI officially labeled the series of murders a targeted vigilante case and launched a full manhunt for Carson Dre. His face appeared on digital billboards, news broadcasts, and across social media. A nationwide tip line was established, but every lead fizzled out. Dre had become a ghost. Despite his detailed planning and violent acts, there was never a single confirmed sighting after the Pennsylvania killing. It was as if he had melted back into the shadows he came from. Some believed he might have taken his own life after completing his mission. Others insisted he was still out there, waiting, watching. Public opinion was sharply divided. For many, Dre was a cold-blooded murderer who had taken justice into his own hands and left behind only fear and blood. But to others, especially those who had suffered quietly, overlooked by systems meant to protect them, he was something else. He was a symbol of reckoning, a shadow who dared to confront what no court had. Debates raged online and on talk shows, questioning whether vengeance could ever be justice and what it meant when the law failed to punish those who deserved it most. Years passed, but no new killings occurred. The trail eventually ran cold. Still, rumors persisted. People claimed to see him in bus terminals, diners, even sitting silently in the back rows of courtrooms where other abuse cases were being heard. None of these sightings were confirmed. Yet his story never faded. It lived in the forums, in hushed conversations, in the fear that justice might come not with a gavel, but with a blade in the night. The murders at Red Willow Lane had opened a door that would never truly close. For the town of Millstone, for the victims of Elridge, and for law enforcement, this case was a grim reminder that when pain is buried long enough, it doesn't disappear. It waits. And when it returns, it does so without mercy.